Tonight we celebrate Travis Holland and his debut novel, The Archivist's Story. Travis Holland is an award-winning short fiction writer whose stories are featured in many prominent national publications. The debut of his novel on Tuesday, June 19, has brought about critical acclaim and sparked excitement in the literary community. Holland is a grad of our own Georgia State, and he holds a Master of Fine Arts degree from the University of Michigan, where he received the prestigious Hopwood Award for this compelling novel. Inspiration for this novel, The Archivist's Story, comes from Holland's research on an obscure history of Russian writers persecuted under Stalin. In this novel, Pavel Dubrov, I probably didn't say it right, did I? Dubrov? I thought your mom might know. Is an archivist in Moscow's in a prison under Stalinist Russia. He's given the task of cataloging and destroying works of writers in the prison. When he stumbles across a manuscript by a new prisoner, the great Isaac Babel, or Babel, he commits the bravest act of his life by hiding the papers rather than destroying them in the incinerator. Holland's novel is truly a tribute to the written word, and The Archivist's Story is something to savor whether you are a literary scholar or merely an appreciative reader. Said Entertainment Weekly, Holland's story of a broken man's decision to put his life on the line for literature is both restrained and bleakly profound. The starred reviews do not come around very often in publications, the trade journals such as Kirkus or Library Journal, but this book got a star review in both of those. And here's a snippet from the Library Journal. There is a quiet authenticity about Holland's writing that draws you in, and soon you will find yourself sitting on the edge of your seat, silently cheering for his characters. Readers will want to hear more from the author of this heartbreaking and haunting work. Ladies and gentlemen, what an honor, what a joy, the author of The Archivist's Story, Travis Holland.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. Wow, I had my notes written down and I lost my notes, so I'm a bit nervous, but please bear with me. First, I want to thank you all for coming. This is an honor. I see so many of my friends and, of course, my family is here, and I can't tell you how happy I am to be here reading and with you all tonight. Also, I'd like to thank the Margaret Mitchell House for having me. This has been an honor. I actually used to live maybe 3 blocks away and have attended readings here, and I never thought that I would be standing here reading. So this is quite an experience. Lastly, I'd like to thank one person in particular, my mother, Cooper Holland, who first taught me to read. So this reading is dedicated to you, Mom. I thought I would give a little background to the book, The Archivist's Story. It's set in Moscow in 1939, and talk a little bit about the process, maybe what led me to write it, some of my inspiration, and then maybe some of the background in terms of Stalinist Russia in 1939, and my experience researching the novel. I made several trips to Moscow to do that, and then read a short section. So. I first read Isaac Babel. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work or have read his work. It was probably 10 years ago, maybe over 10 years ago. I stumbled upon a story of his in an anthology, and I'd never heard of him before, this writer, Isaac Babel. And the story was about 4 pages long, and I went into reading it with no expectations whatsoever, and I finished it with that sensation that you sometimes have when you discover a work of literature or painting or you hear a song, where there's almost a luminous quality to it. It literally changes the way that you see things. you're slightly different. You look at the world slightly different. This was a short story that was 4 or 5 pages long. I was it was almost as if a bell had been struck in me. And the story was called De Grasso. And the end of the story, there's a line in the end, he describes the character looks around and sees the world for the first time in this way, and Babel describes it as being frozen in silence and ineffably beautiful. And that struck me, that way of looking at the world is this: each thing that you see is frozen for a moment. And I'd never seen the world in that way before. And I remember afterwards sort of walking around and seeing everything slightly differently, looking at everything as if it were a still life. And so I read this story and finished it, and it was an amazing experience. Immediately turned to the back of the book. There's a little thumbnail biography of all the authors in this anthology, and only to learn that Isaac Babel had written during the Russian Revolution. He had been a prominent, one of Russia's most prominent writers. In fact, he's one of the greatest practitioners of the short story. He had written his collection, Red Cavalry, back in the mid-20s, 1920s, became a celebrity in Moscow, was heralded as possibly the great writer of the Soviet era, and within 15 years he was dead. He had been arrested by the secret police, he had been imprisoned, and in this particular biography that I read, he had simply disappeared. No one had known what had happened to him. And for many years after his death, it was a mystery as to what had happened to this great writer who simply vanished, but who had written these stories that were so powerful that 80 years later, I could pick them up in Atlanta, Georgia, read them, and feel that experience that changed me. So I had this odd experience of meeting someone and saying goodbye to them at the same moment. And that left a profound impact. That had a profound impact on me. At the time, I didn't know it, but it stayed with me, that sense of someone who could write this beautifully could just vanish and disappear, and the world not know what happened to him. Had quite a profound impact on me. Years later, I was in a bookstore in Atlanta, in a used bookstore, perhaps perfectly for the novel. I happened upon a book written by a Russian writer in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, in which he described the fate of writers under Stalin and what had happened to him. Not just Isaac Babel, but a great many writers had been persecuted. Osip Mandelstam and Kluyev and Babel and even Pasternak, Boris Pasternak, who wrote Dr. Zhivago to some extent, were all under the threat, constantly under the threat of arrest and execution. I found this book. It was called Arrested Voices by Vitaly Shintelitsky. And in this book, he describes having gone into the KGB archives himself in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. He tracked the fate of all these different writers. He got the file, and the first chapter of that book was Isaac Babel, and absolutely riveting and terrifying. It seems that Isaac Babel had been arrested in May of 1939 at his dacha, which was his country home in Peredelkino, which is a suburb of Moscow. He had been arrested one night, in the middle of the night, as so often happened at that moment in time. Arrested, thrown into an unmarked car, and taken to the Lubyanka, which is a building right in the center of Moscow. And he never emerged again. In this particular book that I found, Arrested Voices, described the notes that were taken by the people who interrogated and tortured Babel into confessing to all sorts of bizarre crimes, spying for the Japanese, plots to murder Stalin. It was pure insanity. But as happens with so many individuals, both famous and just average citizens during that time, people confessed because they were tortured and beaten long enough. They confessed to anything. So Babel confessed. Not only did he confess, but he denounced others which was what was demanded of you when you were arrested. You were supposed to denounce others. So he had denounced others. One thing in particular that it didn't disturb me so much as it simply stayed with me was when Babel was arrested, not only was he taken, but all of his manuscripts were seized with him. All the work, all his letters, all of his diaries, but also his short stories that he had been working on, mostly in silence, for 10 years during the worst years of Stalin's terror, the Great Terror of the 1930s in Russia. Because then, at that time, writers had essentially three broad choices. You could write socialist realism, the acceptable fiction, social practice mostly by a writer named Gorky. Stories about the noble factory workers overthrowing the oppressive managers and rising up. You could write socialist realism. You could write children's books, which was safe because you're not sort of talking about the world, you're talking about an idealized world, or you could write nothing. And so your choice was fairy tales for children or fairy tales for grown-ups, essentially, or nothing. And Babel had bravely chosen to write, or at least publish, nothing. He continued to write through the 1930s, but he knew that simply publishing his stories at that time could have gotten him killed because his stories were always brutally honest about the realities in Russia. And that's not what was wanted at the time. That was unacceptable. So Babel wrote constantly, published almost nothing, and became, in his own words, he once jokingly called it master of the genre of silence. He was known for, because he was known mostly for publishing nothing. This writer who, in the 1920s, had published one of the greatest short story collections, Red Cavalry, ever, published nothing. So when he was arrested, his manuscripts were taken with him. They were confiscated. It was almost as if they were arresting the manuscripts as well. And in this book I read by Vitaly Shintsalinsky, The Arrested Voices, it describes basically what happened to Babel and also what happened to his stories to a point. And there was a line in the last, I believe it was the last line of that chapter on Babel that said that the 27 folders that had been seized with Babel, confiscated when he was arrested, they were signed for by a certain junior lieutenant named Kutyrev and never seen again. Never heard from. They vanished. From that point, all trace of them vanished. And that stayed with me. That struck me in the same way that reading Babel's story years before and finding out that he had himself had vanished, that stayed with me. And I began to imagine what had happened, tried to imagine what happened to those stories. They simply can't disappear. And what were those stories? So I began to imagine, and actually a man in Moscow, to where I had never been to Moscow at that time, but I sort of imagined a wintry, snowy scene with a man hurrying home at dusk with a short story hidden under his coat. And that image of that man eventually grew into the idea of, sort of blossomed into the novel and became everything. It became the foundation for the novel itself, the Archivist story. But I'd never actually been to Moscow, as I said, and knew not a great deal. I'd learned as much as I could, and knew that I needed to learn a lot more. So I read everything that I could possibly read on the period and the purges in the 1930s and Babel, and every obscure book and every memoir that I could find. But I lacking that one thing, which was actually been going to Moscow. Even if it was Moscow, 80 years later, I wanted to go. So I just went. I told my wife, my dear wife, I have to go to Moscow. I'm writing a book about Isaac Babel, or I'm writing a book. I don't quite know what it's going to be about yet, but I need to go to Moscow and research this book. So I went, and she wonderfully said, go. So I went in the winter, I believe it was 5 or 6 years ago now, and had an absolutely extraordinary experience. While I was there, I was able to actually interview men and women who had been alive at that time through the good graces of the Andrei Sakharov Foundation. Andrei Sakharov was a dissident, as many of you know probably, was a Soviet dissident in the 1970s who was persecuted by the Soviet government. Well, through his foundation, I was able to interview a number of folks who had lived through the purges, men and women who were now in their 90s. This was the generation that had lived through this. One gentleman, in fact, had actually edited a magazine for a literary magazine for young people, and had actually heard Lenin speak. He had been to speeches by Lenin. He had been to speeches by Stalin. He believed he had maybe met Babel at some point. So it was extraordinary to be sitting in this gentleman's house in Moscow, having read about all this in books. And here he is telling me these stories about what it was like when he was arrested. Or, I was interviewing a woman who was telling me, when she was arrested and sent to the camps at Kolyma. It was an experience that I'll never forget, truly. And I was so profoundly moved by their stories, and simply by my experience. But one of the things that I was struck by when I was in Moscow that was a bit unexpected was the sense that this terrible thing that I had been reading about and imagining, these purges, were literally hundreds of people would be arrested in a night all over the Soviet Union. There would be hundreds of people rounded up, innocent people, for no reason in the middle of the night. And tens of thousands of people were executed and sent to the camps. And by one estimate, by a notable historian, upwards of 20 million people and then died as a result of Stalin's purges and his collectivization. All these programs, this one man, Stalin, had been responsible for the deaths of 20 million people. You think if something like that happened, there would be monuments on every street corner, and that's all people could think about, or at least there'd be some recognition that this thing had happened. And what I was struck by, though, when I was in Moscow, was that there was no trace whatsoever of this. There just simply, it was as if it had not happened. And so I began to think quite powerfully about cultural memory. Not just the memory of an individual, but the memory of a particular culture, how it remembers what it's done or what's happened to its people, and what people perhaps have allowed themselves to do. And so, and in fact, when I was in Moscow, the very building that I describe in my novel, the Lubyanka, which all during Soviet Union's history was the headquarters of the secret police from the time of the revolution, or right after the revolution. It was used to be a headquarters for a Russian insurance company, and it was commandeered by the Bolsheviks, and they turned it into their headquarters for the secret police. That institution, that building, that same building that Babel was sent to all those years ago, is still there in downtown Moscow, and it still is the headquarters of the Soviet secret police, now called the FSB. So the name has been changed. I actually tried to walk into that building. Quite naively, I thought I could just sort of walk in and take a look around. But no, they don't let you. You have to. They do have a museum around back, apparently, where you can go tour and see all the wonderful things, wonderful history of the institution. But that building was still there, and I was just sort of struck by, well, what if something like that had happened here, or there would be a great monument and we'd knock the building down or something. But and in Moscow, it was as if this hadn't happened. But there were these men and women that whom I was interviewing were telling me that it had happened. And in fact, I did find a park, a sort of out-of-the-way park, where when the Soviet Union fell and people were knocking down statues and literally taking them down with cranes and hacking them to pieces, someone had the foresight to rescue some of those Soviet-era statues of Lenin and Stalin. Painful as they were, painful as the memories were and those statues represented, someone had the foresight, or some folks had the foresight to know this is our history and we have to save it. Because if we don't, it's as if it never happened. So there was a little out-of-the-way park that I found off the Moscow River, and it wasn't a particularly organized park. It was just, in a sort of way of Russia, it was just sort of a place someone had set up informally, and there were all these statues of Lenin and Stalin, and these were statues of the era. So they were sort of loving statues of Stalin and Lenin, and there's Stalin standing with his cap and looking off into some bright and glorious future for Moscow. But at the same time, contemporary artists had created their own reflections and their own reactions to that era. So you would have Stalin standing, cap in hand, looking into the future, and behind him would be a statue of some emaciated prisoner from the gulags, looking at his back, which was perfect sort of representation of the era. So again, this idea of this cultural amnesia, the sense that a great terrible thing had been forgotten. I walked around for weeks with that living in that, breathing that, to the point where Moscow began to seem haunted to me. The city just seemed like a haunted place. And that's not to say that there aren't brave individuals and organizations in Moscow that are working very diligently and bravely to retain this memory. Organizations like the Andrei Sakharov Foundation and like Memorial, who document and archive, appropriately enough, the stories of these men and women who lived during the Stalin purges, saving them and doing what they can to keep that memory alive. But it was a small light. It was a small sort of light and a greater sort of sense of, that's the past. Let's leave it there. Let's just forget the past. So I went and made this trip actually in the winter, which is an interesting time to visit Moscow, as I'm sure you can imagine, and went back in the summer. And during one of my visits there, I went twice, I went looking for Babel's grave. I went looking actually first I went looking for the dacha, the country home where Babel was arrested at Peredelkino. It's about 30 kilometers outside Moscow. And I went out there and drove around for an afternoon and could not find any trace of his dacha. I was fortunate enough to find Boris Pasternak's dacha, which is now a museum. Boris Pasternak, as I said, who wrote Dr. Zhivago, that's a great novel, and a wonderful poet as well. His house is still there. The house where he wrote Dr. Zhivago is still there. It is a museum. It's a rather grand house with orchard in front. And I walked through, and I actually met his daughter-in-law. This is one of those moments. I can't believe I'm here talking to Boris Pasternak's daughter-in-law. In fact, we had tea together. It was and little chocolates with liquor inside of them. So, which took the edge off. I'm walking through Pasternak's house, and there's the bed, and there's his little cot, and there's his bed, and there is his desk where he wrote Dr. Zhivago, and of course I was reverent, looking at his books. He had a library, and I was checking out his books like I always do when I go to someone's house, see what they're reading. So I was checking out Pasternak. I think he was reading Faulkner, or he had some Faulkner. And afterward, I went to his grave, And he has a simple, very humble gravestone in a beautiful little cemetery, rather just like a lot of Russian cemeteries. It's sort of just there. It's not a big deal. But I was able to sit at his grave and reflect a moment. There's a little bench there, and reflect a moment. And that experience stood out so strongly when I contrasted it with the experience that I had when I was looking for baubles. Some memory of Babel, some trace of Babel. Pasternak, who himself was certainly lived under a cloud of threat under Stalin, but Babel, when I looked for his dacha, it was nowhere to be found. My guide and translator, a remarkable woman named, her name was Valentina, but we called her the White Tornado because she was about this tall, and she was a professor of English who did translation. She wore a large white fur hat, and she was absolutely fierce. I've seen her get past Kremlin guards, custom agents. She was fearless. She was an extraordinary woman. So I asked Valentina if we could find Babel's home, dacha, and we couldn't. So then I went to try to find his grave, and I had known that he may be buried at a particular monastery in downtown Moscow called the Donskoi Monastery. And if those of you read my book and see in the book that's the monastery at Pavel's house lived. Pavel, and my character Pavel Dubrov, he lives across the Donskoi Monastery. And it is a old, I believe it's 16th century monastery, high pink walls, and inside it is a absolute jumble of a cemetery. It's in summer. Winter I went there, it's nothing much. There's the stones and snow, and in summer it's like an overgrown garden. It's almost like a forest, trees and bushes, and everything's grown up. And in that cemetery, in Donskoi Monastery, there is a crematorium. And during the purges in the 1930s, when people were being executed on a nightly basis, the secret police, the NKVD at the time came to KGB, they would secretly send the bodies there in a truck, because it was all done in secrecy, because it was shameful. Even though it was state-sponsored, there was a sense of shame about it. So at night they would take these bodies there and they would cremate them, and then they would bury them in an unmarked mass grave. It was essentially a pit. And in Donskoi, today, if you go there, there is among all these graves, among all the headstones, there is a single stone monument. And just a single stone plinth on one side of the cemetery, and it's practically bristling with small plaques around it, and little flags and little plastic flowers with people's names on it, and little pictures. Russians, their gravestones, they have a gravestone, and then they'll often have a little picture, an oval picture. So all these tiny plaques, people's names, and some of them had these little pictures. And this is where Babel is believed to have been buried. A common grave. He was probably murdered he was murdered in 1940, in the early months of 1940, and with 14, 15 other people in one night. And he was executed and cremated, and his ashes were dumped into this grave with these others. So, but there's not even a plaque there. All these other plaques that are sort of bristling around this monument, those were put there by family members of people who had lost their loved ones. They cared. They wanted some memory. And they could. They knew that, or they believed perhaps that their loved one was there, so they wanted some memory. But Babel, there was nothing there for him. So I had this distinct experience of visiting Pasternak in his grave and the memory of this man who had existed, and then going and looking for Babel and finding nothing. And I'll just say one last thing, and then I'm going to read a little bit from the book. But this sense of cultural memory is very important. I mean, I believe, in my opinion, it's very important to remember that these things have happened. And it's one of the things my book sort of deals with is memory, of course. But for a culture and a country to remember what's happened, and one of the things I guess I would point to is the fact that when Russians are polled today, particularly young Russians who weren't around at the time of Stalin, Stalin polls quite highly in terms of popularity. Stalin is a very popular figure. And one of the reasons is, people say, is because he was strong and he made Russia strong, and he made Russia a respected place and, a respected nation. And so a great many people think that he was better for the country than bad, even though 20 million people possibly died. So it took 20 million people to do this. And I believe that's because people don't have a true sense, a deep sense of what actually he had done and what had been done by ordinary Russians at that time in Stalin's name. So it is I guess I leave you with a rather dark picture, but I myself was quite disturbed. And it's interesting to see that since the 90s, as many of you probably know, follow the news, Russia had a period of great uncertainty, and now with Putin in office, there is a sort of darkening down again in terms of public free speech, and Putin is seen as quite a strong leader and respected for that. So I will leave you with that, and so that's a considerable amount of context. But I'm going to read a short passage from the book, and then I'd be happy to take questions. All right. So this is from the opening chapter, the first chapter of the Archivist story. And Babel has been arrested. This is several months later. And Babel is being more or less interviewed by the main character in the novel, Pavel Dubrov, who is an archivist in the special section, literature section, which indeed existed at the time. There was a fourth section that was dealt solely with Russian artists who had been arrested. Okay. It is a small matter that brings them together, a story, untitled, unsigned, and by all appearances incomplete, which the arresting officers in their haste have neglected to record in the evidence manifest. A year ago, when the Lubyanka thrummed with activity, when all of Moscow seemed to hold its breath at night, and every morning brought a new consignment of confiscated manuscripts to Pavel's desk, such a discovery would have hardly warranted a second look, let alone this face-to-face meeting the archivist frankly dreads. Babel has confessed. One story will not change that, nor will it save him. Still, Kuterev has insisted the matter be formally resolved, and since Pavel must now answer to the ambitious young lieutenant the question of authorship is to be settled, if only for the record. Already an empty office upstairs has been reserved for the purpose. In due course, the appointed morning comes. Just as the first heavy drops of rain are beginning to fall onto the dreary courtyard below, a guard raps once on the door. Babel enters. I was about to make tea, Pavel offers. On the bureau beside the window sit an electric samovar, a serving tray, tea glasses and spoons, a darkly tarnished tin, all left behind by the office's previous occupant, absent now. Behind the desk, where a row of pictures once hung, the plaster is noticeably lighter. Only nails remain. Would you like to sit down? After a moment, as if Pavel's voice has only now reached him, Babel nods, then sits. He is unshaven. A bruise is fading under his right eye, and a faint film, like dried salt, coats his lips. The wilted wings of his shirt collar lie crookedly across the lapels of his wrinkled coat. And this finally, which Pavel finds most disturbing, the writer's glasses are gone. Somehow, he had expected Babel to appear as he once did in his dust jacket pictures. Pavel lifts the empty teapot from the samovar. I'll just get this filled. At first, the young guard standing watch outside merely stares dully at the teapot, as if he has never laid eyes on one before. He is at most 20, with the sleepy eyes of a peasant. Some displaced farmer's son, perhaps, come to Moscow to better himself. Whatever he is, the expression on his face is familiar enough. Water, Pavel sighs, handing the teapot over. He might as well be back at Kirov Academy, standing in front of a classroom of boys hardly younger than this guard, reading aloud lines of Tolstoy. Ivan Ilyitch's life had been most simple and most ordinary, and therefore most terrible. Sons of want and privilege alike, born in revolution's shadow. It is his former students' generation now joining the numberless ranks, already marching under the banner of collective progress, while their former teachers reconcile themselves to silence. In the 2.5 years since his appointment to the Special Archives, where, until Kutirev's arrival this past May, he was alone, Pavel has become painfully aware of just how fortunate he once was, how blessed. He would give anything to be standing before his students again, book in hand. With the rain has come a kind of false twilight. All week the weather has been like this. Sitting, Pavel pulls the brass chain of the desk lamp, which clatters softly against the green glass shade. I keep hoping we'll get a little sun soon, he says, trying to hide his nervousness. It is not every day one meets a writer of Babel's eminence. He asks, "Are you hungry? I'm sure I could have something sent up if you'd like." "Thank you, no." A high, almost breathy voice. Babel will not even meet his eye. Pavel stares openly at the bruise on Babel's cheek, then looks away. The guard returns with the teapot. At the window again, Pavel fills the samovar. Next door, a telephone rings once, is answered. A watery, pale light cups the rounded side of the warming samovar, spilling over Pavel's hands as he pries open the tin. Only a little tea remains, the blackish, powdery leavings like a kind of sand he tips into the waiting teapot. Tilting the tin toward the light, Pavel catches a glimpse of his own blurred reflection in it. Then he returns to the desk. "Might I ask a question, Comrade Inspector?" I'm not an inspector," Pavel says quickly. "I work down in the archives." Leaning forward, he wipes the green cardboard of Babel's file folder with his fingers. A pink ribbon, neatly tied, holds the folder shut. "Actually," he adds, I used to be a teacher. Believe it or not, I taught your stories." "My stories?" "From Red Cavalry. When one could teach them," Pavel thinks, "when it was acceptable, safe. Some of your later work as well. Guy de Maupassant is a personal favorite of mine. The opening lines of Babel's story, which he is never tired of reading, return to Pavel. In the winter of 1916, I found myself in St. Petersburg with a forged passport and not a cent to my name. Alexei Konstantsev, a teacher of Russian literature, took me into his house." A teacher of Russian literature. The irony stings now. Babel squints at the green folder with an expression of dull, somewhat dazed perplexity, as if Pavel has conjured it up out of nothingness by some sleight of hand. Then his dark eyes empty again. "May I ask," Babel says finally, "what day it is?" "Tuesday." "Is it still June?" "July." "Already." At least that is what Pavel thinks he hears Babel murmur. Already. It has been barely 2 months since Babel's arrest, 2 months since the customary unmarked car carried him at dawn through the enormous black gate of the courtyard below. Has he lost his grip on time? Or perhaps, Pavel imagines, Babel is simply, quietly, stunned, that he could be brought down so fast, so completely. That in only 2 months he could become the battered, cowed shell of a man now sitting in this all but abandoned office. Pavel remembers his own first months at the Lubyanka, themselves a stark revelation, though it is obscene to compare his experience with Babel's. He has not suffered 1/10 the torment Babel has likely had inflicted on him, days without sleep or food or water, threats, beatings. Pavel says, I've been asked, ordered, to clear up a discrepancy in your file. It's just a formality. What sort of discrepancy? A manuscript my supervisor happened upon while reviewing your file. A story. Quite a remarkable story. There's no record of it in the evidence manifest, which means it can't be officially attributed to anyone, yourself included, which means, officially speaking, Pavel shrugs uncomfortably. It doesn't exist. As I said, it's just a formality. If you could perhaps take a look, tell me if you recognize it. Can you read without your glasses? Barely. I was told they would be returned to me, Babel says, if I cooperated. Cooperated. Confessed, he means. And in doing so likely implicated others. Nowadays, one cannot simply confess. One must also denounce acquaintances, colleagues, friends, even one's own family, whom, if anyone, has Babel drawn into the net that has now fallen over his life. Eisenstein, perhaps, Ehrenberg, Pasternak. A man of Babel's prominence would be expected to name others at least as well known as himself. I spent my mornings hanging around the morgues and police stations. The line, another from Guy de Maupassant, echoes through Pavel's brain as he walks once more to the window where the samovar has begun to boil. Steam shimmers on the glass. I'm afraid we'll have to make do without sugar, he apologizes, filling the teapot. A sedan is just then pulling into a parking space in the courtyard below, wipers briskly slapping away rain. The wipers cease. The driver's door swings open. An umbrella emerges, blooms, a black peony. Morgues and police stations, Pavel thinks. That is what this age will be remembered for. That is our legacy. Sugar, Babel asks, as if the word were new to him. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I'd be happy to take questions now. So, if anyone has a question or a comment, I'd be happy to hear it. Yes?
Now that you've published your first novel, has your approach to writing changed as you work on your new work?
That's a great question. Has my approach to writing changed since this book was published? I would say that the effort has gone into making sure that the approach in the process doesn't change. When I wrote this book, I wasn't represented. I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a publisher. I didn't know what would happen to it, this particular book. I just wrote it because the story was something that would not let me go. So I wrote it not knowing, right? And thank God it was published after 2 trips to Moscow and God knows how much money. So yes, it was published. Now I find, just with the second book, that trying to quiet that sense of expectation, my own expectation, perhaps expectation from a publisher or a reader, that is where I'm putting my effort now, is just to try to go back to what I was like and what it was like writing this book, which is a sense of no expectation, no hope, in a good way, right? Writing it with no sense of what's going to happen, and just allowing myself to think about the story and the writing itself, which is always going to be the most important aspect of getting anything done. Any other questions? Yes?
Travis, is Babel known by the young generation?
That's a good question. Is Babel known by Russian writers now, or Russians now, young Russians? I would imagine among, I guess, Russians who care a great deal, Russian writers, young writers, yes, he is. Probably the population at large, like most populations at large, maybe don't particularly care a great deal about a short story. One short story, I don't think most people get the same kind of thrill I get when I read a great short story. But so he is respected a great deal. His legacy is respected a great deal. And Russians, not to generalize, but I did find that Russians are extraordinary, care a great deal about literature, their own literature, and their poets in a way that I've never experienced with any other country. The sense of, you have streets named after Pasternak or Gogol, and there's monuments, and I don't quite see that anywhere else, any place I've been. The good thing is Babel, there has been something of a resurgence, international resurgence and interest in Babel and his legacy. A few years ago, there was a complete edition of his stories put out by his daughter. So he is a writer who is among writers, perhaps most of all among writers, revered, and hopefully among the populations, other people known at the very least. Yes, ma'am.
Charles, do you have any idea the volume of short stories that were taken away when he was taken away in 1939? And what truly did become of those? Were they saved?
Well, the stories that were seized, I believe they would constitute probably a collection of stories, because from everything I've read, I read Babel's diary at the time. There is a collection of his letters, and I'm not his diary, a collection of his letters that he was sending to his wife abroad and to his sister and to his mother. He does mention these stories that he's working on, and that he's just getting them ready, hopefully to do something with, to publish them. He at least has a book of stories. So I would imagine that would be 10, 15 stories, perhaps more with him because he wrote such small stories. I believe, though, that there may have been more stories. So there's no real answer to that, because the stories that were signed for, those manuscripts that I mentioned earlier that were signed for by this young officer Kutirev, who actually shows up in my book, they vanished, and they were probably burned. But one hopes that they may be found. I remember when I was writing this book, I came upon a story about a manuscript that was found in the Far East. I believe it was maybe Vladivostok. In some library there, someone found, they moved some shelves, and they found a sort of hole back there, or a place where you couldn't really see unless you were looking for it. They found a manuscript back there, and it was a manuscript written by a Russian scholar of Chinese literature. He was a professor, and all of his books, when he was arrested, or all of his work was seized and destroyed, and his books quickly became quite unpopular. You can imagine, this man has been condemned by the state. You don't want to be seen reading his book. So all of his work, or most of it, had vanished. Someone, and they don't know who, had hidden his work, hidden his book of his, this obscure professor. And I remember at the time when I was writing my book thinking, well, someone did it, and maybe it can happen. I hope they find his stuff someday. Yes. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
You write with a great deal of substance, and there's so my guess is down the road your work will even be more revered than it is now. The question, though, is it seems like that substance sometimes is hard to get through an agent.
Mm-hmm.
And to get through a writer, you have a passion for the injustice that was done. Sometimes that passion doesn't allow you to tell the story in a way that makes it comprehensible. How did you make sure that you stay focused to what you really want to stay focused on?
Yes, sir. How did I stay focused to the sort of substance of the book or the substance, the seriousness of it, while also understanding this is a marketplace and agents and publishers. And that's a good question, and that is a good concern. I will say that when I wrote the book, I really didn't know if anyone would be interested in a book about Isaac Babel instead of 1939 in the Soviet Union. So I didn't even think about what's going to happen to this book, you know. I mean, this is a rather dark subject matter, and I think most of the reviews that I've read have talked about it being rather melancholy or depressing, some even call it, which I didn't want it to be. So what I did was I tried to very much to stay true to the story that I was writing. I mean, even as dark as it was, I do like a good story. I do love books that move and go somewhere. And so while I was, and one of my models, or one of the writers I revere quite a lot, is Graham Greene, who was somehow able to write books that were both very serious and sort of, quite readable. He wrote that. He bridged that in a way that's absolutely brilliant. And there's any number of other writers who write very riveting and very moving stuff. So I do think at times I would sort of spur myself on if I was spending too much time static in one place, the scene wasn't moving. I wanted to keep it moving because I wanted to keep the sort of story moving along in a way. So I guess I was aware of both of those elements. Yes?
Are you aware when you write that you have a certain style that you, and when you write another book, are you going to be consciously trying to do something?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the style thing and trying to do it differently. You know, the style for this book, which is sort of rather terse, it's a rather short. It's a short novel, and I think the sentences, a lot of them are quite short and clipped, have that quality to them. And I thought that that was simply the way I was writing at the time. I mean, I wish I could modulate my voice in the way that some great writers do. They write in one way for one book, or they write in a completely different way. This seems to be the voice that this book was going to be written in. And I was, after I finished it, and you know, eagerly turning to the next project, because this project took me so long. I had several projects waiting in the wings, or sort of sitting there waiting, that I wanted to do something different. Even if I was just, this book is in the third person, and it's rather a close third person perspective, as you writers out there know them. The close third perspective, and I didn't want to do that again. So I did try to, the next book I'm writing is in the first person. It is a person's voice, and it is actually a young woman writing. So we'll see where that goes, what becomes of that. Yeah, any other questions? Yes? This book, well, that's a tough question. Because probably the research and the writing of the book was 6 or 7 years, thinking about the book, not knowing what the heck I'm doing, but sort of experimenting in false starts. Probably 6 or 7 years. Once I settled down and knew this was the book, this was the story, this was the way I was going to tell it, about 5 years, which is an awful long time to spend, as my wife will tell you. My dear wife. So about 5-6 years on this book, and then it took another year or two to go through the publishing process as well, and working with my editor at Dial. So quite a long time. Yes.
In those 5 or 6 years, in that process, did you share it with groups of people? Did you hear it?
Sure. The process, as far as the writing of the book, I don't inflict my work on my wife. I think that's why we've been married all this time, is I don't make her read it in early stuff. She reads it when it's pretty much ready to print. I was fortunate enough I did go to the University of Michigan, and they have an extraordinary writing program there, And I did workshop the novel, which among you, those of you who write and have workshop, can be a rather exhilarating process. So I did have, this book has been knocked around by 12 people, all telling me, I love that scene. And then someone else tells me, I hate that scene. Kill it. So what do you do, right? But so they read it, and they were, my teachers there were quite generous about it and encouraged me. But by the time I got there, I really knew what I was doing, knew that this was the book, and I just sort of plowed through. Do we have time for one more question? One more question? Anyone? And another question? Yes, ma'am.
So, you say that his daughter is still alive and she's pretty.
I believe his daughter passed away after she put out this collection. She several years ago, she did put out, Natalie Babel did put out this large collection of his complete work. It's his stories, his reportage. He was a reporter, his diaries, things like that. And I would recommend it to any fan of Babel's work. The translation is not necessarily my favorite one, but she, I believe she has since passed away.
Does the lineage go on? Did she have children?
I don't know. I certainly should. Thank you. I will. I'll track him down. And I wrote this for you. Hey, well, thank you all so much for coming out. It's been a real honor. And there's the bed, and there's his little cot, and there's his bed, and there is his desk where he wrote Dr. Zhivago, and of course I was a reverend, looking at his books at a library, and I was checking out his books like I always do when I go to someone's house. See what they're reading, so I was checking out Pasternak. I think he was reading Faulkner. He had some Faulkner. And afterward, I went to his grave. He has a very simple, a very humble gravestone in a very beautiful little cemetery. Rather, just like a lot of Russian cemeteries, it's sort of just there. It's not a big deal. That I was able to sit at his grave and reflect a moment. There's a little bench there, and reflect a moment. And that experience stood out so strongly because